Hey everyone, I'm Jack with riverjackstudio, and in this mess of a video I make a mosaic board as a gift out of every species of wood in my shop. First I'm going to have to sort through all the scrap so I can find enough decent pieces that will work for this project. I want the board to end up being around 13 inches by 18 inches and around an inch thick, all being in grain. I went through all the pieces and I ended up having 10 total species, which are walnut, bloodwood, purple heart, mesquite, Osage acorn, sugar maple, pit oak, red oak, white oak, and zebrawood. I go ahead and plane down all the pieces. I had previously done this before when I used them in other projects, but because they had sat for such a long time, I went ahead and made sure that everything was flat. I then went over to my joiner and jointed one sides of all the pieces and then took them over to my table saw and made 3 different widths at 1.5 inches, 1 inch, and 3/4 inches. These pieces were all then grouped by their size, and I tried to mix the colors as evenly as possible, and I would take half of the overall length of the shortest piece of each group. So then I can mix up the colors again and take 2 groups from each set that I had. I did this for all the width groups, taking them over my miter saw and cutting the marks I had previously made. So I ended up with 6 distinct width and color groups to glue up together. There were a lot of colors in here, and I was hoping that no one color would overtake the board, so I tried to use every piece evenly throughout the board and spread out the similar colors as much as possible. The serving board is actually a favor for my sister. Her first roommate from college just graduated with a master's in mechanical engineering while working full-time. So as a gift for her, she's getting an in-grain serving board that she can use to serve cheese to everyone. I glued all 6 groups together using Titebond 3 as it's both waterproof and has the highest bond strength. They were all glued with their width groups, and it didn't need to be perfect as they would all be flattened and cut at 1 inch and turned upright for the in-grain pattern. So any loss I would have would be on the link side when they get turned upright. So I didn't use any cauls and instead just gave it a few smacks with the dead blow hammer, and that seemed to work well enough. I then let them sit for 24 hours to make sure they had plenty of cure time, and then I took some of the clamps off and I then let them sit overnight to cure enough for me to take the clamping pressure off. I then took a chisel and got off as much of that hardened glue as possible before I could send it through the planer. While I was scraping off all the glue, I noticed one of my pieces of wood split down the middle. Because I was making this board out of scrap, some pieces either already had checks from shrinkage in them or were rotted. Something I should have paid a little more attention to when selecting my pieces, because this would come back to bite me later on. But for now, I went ahead and glued the piece back together and let it sit for another 24 hours to come back to once again. I then send everything through the planer. Because the pieces were shorter than the minimum distance required by the planer, I end up hot gluing them down to a piece of plywood sled so that it won't cause any pitting. I do this with all the pieces until everything was perfectly flat, and I end up losing only about an 1/8 inch on each piece. I then needed to square the ends, and because I didn't have a table saw sled, I just hot glued a flat piece of maple to the end and squared off. I used the same method on the rest of my pieces and took them all through so they would be perfectly flat against the fence whenever I cut them to size. I then cut all the panels at 1/8 inch to give me a little wiggle room when I go to flatten the board after gluing it up. I then had all the strips I needed to do my final glue up, so I flipped them end grain up and oriented them to be random and have no repeating strips next to one another. But then my mistake caught up to me again. There were several pieces of rotten walnut and maple throughout. I thought about leaving them in and just cleaning out the rotted pieces and epoxying the rest, but I didn't have food safe epoxy, nor did I have the time to let it cure. So I just decided to go ahead and cut out the rotten pieces and glue in new pieces of wood. I settled on some more maple and walnut and I glued those in and let an hour go by. Because these strips would be glued up into the mosaic, I did need to wait the full 24-hour cure time to make sure it was stable. I think by me overlooking all of the rotten and checked pieces earlier, I added something like 2 extra days to this board and like additional 7 or 8 hours worth of work. So it's a good thing this was a gift and I wasn't making it to sell because I wouldn't make a dime on it. I unclamped the strips and I set everything up to glue the whole board together. I used Titebond 3 again and glue up the whole pieces the way I did earlier, except I make sure that the end grain is up this time and I let another day go by. So for those of you that don't know, end grain is the wood seen when it's cut across the growth rings. I think the details of the wood is a lot more interesting this way, as you can see the different growth rings, directions of the piece, and even some color variation when it's oriented this way. Most butcher blocks are done this way because the wood fibers are able to absorb the force because the blade is being caught between the natural separation of the wood fibers, which will close back up over time, and it also doesn't nick or gouge as easily as traditional cutting boards that are oriented the other way. I have a little bit of a hard time getting the clamps off as they've also glued themselves to the board, but after a few smacks with the dead blow hammer, it comes right off. I then took a chisel to all the excess glue and scraped everything off before I'd attempt to flatten it. Normally you shouldn't send end grain through a planer as it's liable to catch on the grain and destroy the board and possibly the planer itself. I'd normally use a router to flatten end grain, but I just changed the blades on my planer and I'm terrible about following good advice. So if I was careful, hopefully nothing bad would happen, and I end up just sending it through and I took less than about a 64th of an inch off on each pass, which surprisingly worked out pretty well. I just took very little off at a time and I ended up sending it through about 6 or 7 times. I then needed to square the ends, so I took one side over to the joiner and took less than a 64th inch off each time as well, and took the other side through my table saw to finish squaring off the edges. After doing this, I did a good look over my board and I noticed another rotten piece of walnut in it. So I got my chisel and chiseled it out as best as I could, trying to square the edges and make sure I could get a piece to fit perfectly in there. I then took a piece of pit oak and smeared it with glue and hammered it in to set up. After waiting several hours, I then took a flush cut saw and cut it flush to the board. I then went and grabbed my router and added a chamfer around both sides of the board to break up the square edges. This would also prevent nicks and dings as well. I then started sanding the board, hand sanding the edges with 60 grit all the way around, and then moving my way up from 60 to 80 to 120 to 180 to 220 to 320, spraying with water in between grits to pop the grain. Because it's end grain and a mosaic, it's important to raise the grain so there's no lip in between the pieces. I made sure to sand thoroughly with each grit, as end grain is much harder to sand due to the orientation of the grain, and because it had over 10 species of wood with varying hardness, I needed to make sure everything was sanded evenly. I then added Odie's oil, which is a hard wax finish. After it cures, it is food safe, and I didn't want to use mineral oil like a traditional cutting board as it would really darken the pieces too much. I then needed to add some feet, so I pre-drilled holes on the bottom using a centering jig and added rubber feet to the bottom of the board. I then needed a way to carry and hold the board, and I had bought some copper handles for another project, but they were a bit small for it, so I decided to go ahead and add them to this board. I just made sure they were spaced evenly edge from edge, and pre-drilled one hole to shoot a screw into to hold it, and then did the exact same thing on the other side, repeating the same steps for the other handle. And here's the finished product. The random mosaic colors look really good, and I think Melissa will be really happy with the board. I ended up having to do 2 days shipping on this thing so she could get it in time for a graduation party because I couldn't tell you what the term time management means. Thanks everyone for watching. My Etsy is linked in the description below. Every purchase helps me get one step closer to moving out of my parents' basement, so it's totally appreciated. I'd also appreciate it if you all liked, commented, and subscribed for more woodworking content. Thanks everybody so much, and I'll see you all next week.